Hi, my name's Dennis Frederick. I was born in 1964, and this is a primary source recording of my recollections of the 1960s. Now, since I was only an infant in the 1960s, it's not going to be historical facts like the election of 1968 or where was I when the Beatles got their big hits in 1964. These are going to be the recollections of an infant's view of the 1960s. So I'd have to say, starting chronologically, the first thing I remember of the 1960s was not being able to understand what people were saying. I remember people talking to me, especially my mom talking to me, and it was like some kind of jibber jabber because I couldn't understand any of it. It seemed like it was some sort of communication, but I couldn't make it out. So I spent my very early time when I couldn't understand what was going on trying to analyze what was happening around me and understand what all of this was. And I remember doing that. I remember thinking to myself and trying to figure out what all was going on. So I remember not being able to understand people talking, and eventually that just transitioned to where I could understand people, which was rather peculiar. I don't really understand quite how that happened, but it did. And I also remember before I was able to walk, I remember learning to crawl, and I remember learning to crawl very fast because I wanted to be everywhere quickly. Even after I could walk, I walked as little as possible. I ran just as much as possible. But I remember before I could walk that I learned to crawl really, really quickly and efficiently to get across the hardwood floors in my house. So I remember a few memories from before I could speak and before I could walk. So this is my newborn picture, and everyone's newborn pictures are really pretty bad. And so this doesn't look too good, but this is me at the earliest stage. I don't know what was going on in my head then, but that's me. And this is me. I look about three there, and this is my family. And at the time, they were operating a tropical fish shop out of our living room, and that's what's in the background is a whole bunch of tropical fish tanks. And we were quite poor and living in central New York in rather extreme rural poverty, but we had a good time. It was everyone had a great sense of humor. In It was a really optimistic time still somehow. So I remember about this age, I was around three when I had a hernia operation, and I don't remember having the hernia, and I don't remember the operation. I don't even remember the site of the recovery or anything like that. But what I do remember is being in the hospital because that was quite an experience. I was in a room with a lot of cribs in it. And I had to stay in there for a day or two. And I remember one of the nurses came around and asked me what I wanted for breakfast, and I was kind of incredulous because I couldn't imagine there being choices. So, and I asked if it could be any kind of cereal, and they said, yeah, it could be any kind of cereal you want. And that blew me away because I couldn't imagine there being more than one or two types of cereal ever available at one time. So I said, Tony Tiger? And they said, yeah, you can have Tony Tiger. And I was like, wow. So that was like I was just in heaven because I couldn't get Tony Tiger at home. That was expensive cereal. So that was great. I just ate Tony Tiger, which is Frosted Flakes, just as much as I could while I was there, because you just can't get that otherwise. And I also remember towards the end of the stay at the hospital, my dad brought me uh, Gumby and Pokey toys. Gumby and Pokey were some claymation figures who had a TV show, a kids show, and I watched Gumby and Pokey on TV back then. And I remember it was in the 1960s packaging, which I even remember what it looked like. I probably should put up a picture of what it was like. And I had not just one of them, but both of them, which was crazy because we never had store-bought toys. And these were both store-bought toys in packaging, and it wasn't just one, it was both of them. So that was mind-blowing. And my sister Diane, who's here in the picture behind me, remembers that to this day. She was upset then, and she's, been upset the whole time and has given me hell for like 50 years that I got Gumby and Pokey brand new when I was a kid, and she didn't get anything like that. But I'm sure it was only because I was in the hospital and he was worried about me. And I remember my dad. Visiting me in the hospital, and this was about approximately the age I was, and approximately the age he was. So it was right about this time that I had that hospital stay, and that was a good memory for me. Eventually, later on, just a couple of years ago, I was out in Oregon, and I was in a gift shop that was attached to Chowder House, strangely enough, of all places. And I saw Gumby and Pokey in the same 1960s packaging that I had that time. So I bought it, and I brought it back. I flew it 3,000 miles with me, carried it all the way back, and gave it to my sister Diane. And I told her, okay, here you go, Gumby and Pokey, the exact ones I had. Now shut the hell up. So, she thought that was just great, of course, because, your little brother giving you something you've been wanting for 50 years. And even that you can find it, because they've been out of production for a long time. And it was even in the same packaging. So that was pretty amazing. And I remembered I played with those original toys. I remember playing with them until the wires showed in all the joints. So I literally played with them until the plastic wore out. And they were bendable wire, plastic with wire inside. So you could pose them in different ways. And eventually, if you pose them enough, the plastic actually falls apart in the joints and the wires are exposed. So I played with them until, that happened. And somehow they disappeared. And I don't remember them disappearing, but somehow they eventually disappeared when they fell apart too much. So, yeah, that was about, let me see, 64, 65, 66, 67. That would have been about 1967. So that's a lot of my recollections about through there. And it's surprising that I have so many recollections from when I was when I was that young. I also remember so I remember them visually. I remember scenes in my head. So another scene I remember was being forced to take a nap. This would have been when I was about 4. So it was like the year before kindergarten. And I was still being forced to take naps, and I didn't want to take naps. And I think I stayed awake most of the time. And my mom would have on her soap operas in the living room, and every day it would be Days of Our Lives. And I remember the tune. I'd heard it so many times. And I might even be able to attach it to this video, but it was black and white on of course the TV was black and white, so who knows if it was color. And it was all optical effects, so it was an hourglass superimposed over the title. They didn't have any digital effects at that time. So it was just sort of cheesy optical effects and this organ music that they would play. And that was her stories in the afternoon. And it was Days of Our Lives was the one she watched religiously. And I just hated it. I couldn't stand it at all. It was just such a waste of time as far as I was concerned. But so that was probably the last year that I was home, stayed still home before kindergarten, was when I was awake enough in naps, and I remembered the terrible soap operas that were on TV. So let's see what the next picture is to bring us along here. This is me. It looks, wow, I look even younger there. That might even be my 2. Wow. So that's Christmas, and I'm real little. That's Christmas in the basement of the house that my dad built. We'll be able to take a pic. I think we'll be able to look at a picture of that house. Can't really see. Truck something is what I'm opening, but I don't remember what it was. But I remember the very earliest Christmases were in the basement of the house my dad built in Lodi. Oh, and this is the house my dad built. We were dirt poor, is the way we used to refer to it, and my dad was a laborer. Before they lived here, he had moved. They had moved around when my older brothers and sisters were younger, and he had worked at a lumber camp, just any place that a laborer could make a living. He didn't have a high education. I don't think he finished. He didn't finish high school, and I don't know if he even got to high school. And because what happened is his parents split up when he was young, and he had to go to work immediately at that point to try to earn money so they could live. Because there was no public assistance, they didn't have any of that at all. So he immediately had to go to work way too young. He was one of the smartest guys I ever met, but he didn't get to stay in school because of his parents splitting up and needing food. So he was basically a laborer, and he eventually became an electrician, so a skilled laborer he worked his way into. But the first house we had that I remember is this one, and this is where we lived in the 1960s. And this was a house he built out of scraps and leftovers from construction projects. So this isn't really from a plan or from anything. The house was built in sections. As I recall, this section here on the left side was the first house, was the first part of the house. And then he built on the other parts. So the house is really in three parts. There's this side section, there's the big back section, and there's the front section. And it was all built by the time I came around, but it was built in parts, and I think they were living in the parts as he was building it. And it was built on the farmland of my mother's parents. So, and they were the Fishers, and they gave each of his daughters, my mother and her siblings, a little section of frontage on Route 414 in Lodi here, that where they cut out of the farm. And those houses that they cut out and those sections of frontage are still on 414. But the farm has long since, it was sold to the Boy Scouts for $1. My grandmother, after my grandfather died, sold it to the Boy Scouts for $1 because she would rather donate. She didn't want to sell it and then divide up the money, and she really wanted to donate it in a way that the land would be used for Boy Scouts or nature or something like that. So eventually, after the Boy Scouts, it became part of the Finger Lakes National Forest. So if you look at the map of the Finger Lakes National Forest, there's one block of it that's separated from the rest, and it's over on Seneca Lake, and it's a section that goes from 414 all the way down to the lakeshore. And that was my grandfather's Fisher's farm. And that was the farm that they cut the sections out of to make this house and my other aunt's houses. So this is where this is where I lived in the 1960s. And it looked like it was a pretty snowy winter. This is me. It was the summertime, the same house. This is my tricycle. I look, about 4 here, maybe 5. So this would be like 1968, something like that. And you can see the sign here for that tropical fish store that was in the picture from a year or two earlier. And this was the sidewalk that led up to the house. So the house is down here out of shot to the right. So what I used to do is get up, put my tricycle at the top of this walk, and I wouldn't sit on it. I would stand on the back with one foot on the tread here and the other foot pushing off, because you can go a lot faster that way. And you notice it's going downhill, so it slopes downhill towards the house, and it's very smooth. So I would get sailing as fast as possible down this sidewalk. And once you get to about here out of shot, or actually a little bit farther, probably about here out of shot, you'd hit the front step of the house. The sidewalk ends and you have a raised step. That's the front stoop of the house. And the trick was you could get going really fast down here, but you had to turn off before you smashed into the front step, which would tip you forward and smash you face first into the house. So instead what I would do is I would turn off, and that would usually work. But sometimes I would wait just a little bit too late, or it would be going a little bit too fast, and I would turn off, but the momentum would carry me forward. And there was a few times I smacked my forehead straight on that concrete step. And there are photos, I don't have one right here, but there are photos where I have a scab right here on my forehead where I had just recently bashed my head on the front step. And of course, they were worried I was going to kill myself, which, I could have. Because, flying head first into a concrete step with your forehead, that's not, that could do you in. But nope, I have no signs of brain damage that I can tell anyway. I mean, who knows really? But yeah, there were a few photos with me with a scab on my forehead because of that sidewalk and because of that front step, and that was the tricycle I used to do it on. So that was my daredevil phase, I guess. And yep, that was the 1960s. Here, boy, I'm having a great time. Obviously, my dad used to take us fishing, and this is up on what is now the National Forest. I'm not sure which pond this is. I'm trying to recognize this bank. I think it's Teeter Pond on the National Forest. Yeah, I think so. I think it's the far part of Teeter Pond. There are two sections to Teeter Pond. The first one is by the parking lot. Well, there's now a parking lot. There didn't used to be. And then if you go farther, there's another big section of the pond. And that's what this is, I think, because that's what this bank looks like. And this is my sister Diane, who did not get a Gumby and Pokey. And here I am. And I'm bored as heck, obviously, because these ponds, maybe you catch a bullhead once in a while, but there's not a lot of fish in them. And this is my grandpa Alonzo Frederick, and that's my brother Dale, and that's my brother Don. I can make out, and we're all fishing, and I am bored out of my gourd. But I really like my grandpa Alonzo. I didn't get to know him long enough. This is me in a classic VW microbus. If we had it, that meant that this was a very old VW microbus, and as you can see, it's got rust out of the side. And they made these starting in the 1950s, and I can't remember when they ended, but it was right around the 1970s. And so in the 1960s and 70s, you would see a lot of old microbuses driving around. And today, these things are very, very sought after, because they all wore out. People drove them until they would get scrapped, and that's what happened to this one. By the time we had it, it was an old vehicle. It was something that rather people of really modest means could afford, but who had a big family. Like we had a really big family, and you could fit us all in here. And I remember riding up and down 414 between Watkins and Lodi and Hector. In this microbus, which was, really pretty cool. Now, if I could go back now, I would appreciate it more, because I realized that this is kind of a special vehicle in the history of vehicles. And I remember one time, my mom parked it at our house at the driveway, and she didn't quite get it in park, and it went rolling down the hill until it hit a tree. And that wasn't the end of the microbus. It was able to take that experience pretty well. But I remember my mom didn't quite park at one time, and it went for a ride by itself. Fortunately, it hit a tree before it got too far. And hopefully, I don't think it was too hard. Oh, and this is my last picture from the 1960s. This is my kindergarten picture. I went to kindergarten, I think it was 1969-70 school year. So I think these were taken very early in the school year. So this would have been late 1969. So I probably just turned 5 here. Yeah. So that's me in 69. I should mention I don't have a photo of it, but another thing I remember from the 1960s is I do remember one historic event from the 1960s, which is I remember the Apollo moon landing. And I remember it because it was all that was on TV. They preempted everything. I think it was on every channel. But at my house, on the big floor standing, big black and white television with wood all around it. TVs were furniture back then. It was on for hours and hours during the day. And so I saw the moon landing. I wasn't very excited about it because I just wasn't into it. I was playing with trucks on the floor in front of the TV, and that's what I was interested in. It was playing with toys and playing with my trucks on the hardwood floor in front of the TV. And I remember that. So I really wasn't into the moon landing, but I understood at the time that it was somehow a really big deal to everybody. All the adults seemed to think this was just a huge, huge thing. And I didn't really get it at the time, just how big of a deal it was or how difficult it was. And I didn't understand the Cold War at the time either, so it was mostly beyond me. But I remember it being on. It was on for hours and hours and hours, and the grainy black and white footage from the moon itself was on TV. I remember it, like Neil Armstrong stepping on the moon. I saw that first run, which is kind of cool to be able to say. Although I wasn't much into it, I happened to be there at the time because the floor in front of the TV was the best place to play at the time. So I saw a bunch of that stuff. Not that I was into it, but still, it's really cool to be able to say I remember the moon landing. And I think that was 1969. So that was right towards the end of the 1960s. So that was probably not that was near the time that this photo was taken. And as you can see, I was really enjoying life at the time. I was very, very bright-eyed, and I had not been beaten down by life at all. I was very, very outgoing. And in fact, believe it or not, you can't tell it by the photos in the 1970s, but I was extroverted at the time, and I've always been somewhat extroverted. And you can see it here. This is my core. This is what I'm really like. In the 70s, I got to middle school and high school, and I became a repressed extrovert who seems like an introvert, but it's not really. They're just repressed by social anxiety. But this is really me at my core. This really captures me. So let's see. I think that's what I recall mainly from the 1960s. As I said, I'm not going to recall a lot of historic events from the 1960s because I saw it from the eyes of a very young person. But so my recollection of the 1960s are like the recollections of someone who's 5 or 6 or under. I should mention my favorite TV was a big thing to little kids back then. And I got to say that my favorite television show was Captain Kangaroo, who was I think it's Bill Keachum. It was you can see clips of it if you go looking online. You can see bits of Captain Kangaroo, but I remember the theme song and I remember what they did on the show a lot of the time. And especially before I went to kindergarten, I did see a lot of Captain Kangaroo, and I thought that was great. Captain Kangaroo was a great show. It was a funny show, and it went on for another decade or so after that. I stopped watching it probably in maybe when I went to school or in the early 70s because I think it was on in the daytimes. So once I was in school, I don't think I was seeing it. But in the late 1960s, Captain Kangaroo was really the kid show to watch. It was
still making it in the 80s.
Oh yeah. So I guess it was still on in the 80s, but I think of course he had aged a whole lot by then. But in the 1960s he was still spry and energetic, and Mr. Green Jeans, who actually was associated with the zoo in the area, they would bring a lot of animals on the show. So Mr. Green Jeans, who's actually I believe also worked at the zoo, would bring real animals on the show to demonstrate, and I thought that was pretty cool too. So Captain Kangaroo was the kid show that I remember at the time, and that's the one I really appreciated. So I think that's what I recall of the 1960s. If I think of any more, maybe I'll do an addendum to this video. But that's my first-hand primary source information for the 1960s. So with that, I'll wrap this up.